BookTube. Today's video is a video I wanted to do a few weeks back, but just didn't get around to filming it. It's a classic case on this channel. This is a collection of books I read during the Martin Luther King Day sort of weekend. I think I started a couple days before the actual holiday came about. It was sort of a readathon I gave myself. It wasn't anything like I announced or anything. I just felt compelled to kind of pick up some of these books and honor the day. And so I just wanted to talk about them. And I know Martin Luther King Day is well past, but we are in Black History Month, so I feel like it's still relevant, and it's important history that's relevant at any time, really. So let's get into them. So the first one I went into was Harriet Tubman by Petry. And this is a middle grade, it's a biography, but it's written to sound like a novel. I think to appeal to younger readers, because you know how it was in school when you're having to read biographies of people and they were born in and they went to school in. It's really easy to tune off or tune out when you have that kind of format. So this is written in a way so that it sounds novelized, but it's actually meant to be a biography. And it just tells the story of Harriet Tubman. One of the things I really liked about this was it does go over a lot of history that either was glazed over or not brought up at all in pretty much any history book I remember in grade school. For instance, it talks about, we're taught that she's born to slave parents, she grew up a slave. But what a lot of history books don't talk about was just Harriet Tubman as a character, you know, her inner strength and who she was as who she might have been as an individual. This gets into how she was strong as a woman, even growing up as a young girl, being very independent minded and very strong in herself and confident and secure in her abilities. It talks about how she, her mother had tried to push for her to be a house slave because she thought that would be an easier life for her, but Harriet, who was actually born under a different name, she actually preferred to be outside. She liked the outdoors. She liked being with the trees and the animals. She liked the challenge of you know, working with the elements and working with her hands, and she took pride in the fact that she could handle all the tasks that were normally assigned to the male slaves, such as chopping wood and hauling lumber and things like that. She could do all those things. And one of the stories I was really impressed with in here was it talks about how Harriet actually manages to work out a business deal with her, I don't know if it was her owner or another slave owner she got into business with, but she works out a business deal with the slave owner where she can go out and find her own work, and he gets, I think it's like the agreement they came to was that she was supposed to pay him something like $50 or $60 a year for the ability to go out and find these jobs for herself, but he allowed her to keep any other money she earned, which from the books I've read, that's pretty unprecedented for a female slave to work out that kind of business deal where she got to keep all her own money pretty much. So, I mean, she's an incredible woman that I think is not taught deeply enough. Another thing I really liked about this was when you get to the end of the chapters, there are historical little, it's just a quick little paragraph at the end of the chapter that gives you kind of like historical relevance to something else that was going on in that time that sort of helps you place where Harriet was in history at that point in her life. To give you an example, there's one in here, I think it's when Harriet was still a child, maybe at this point I think she may have been in her maybe like early teens possibly. And at the end of this chapter, it, oh, nope, sorry. I just noticed that. It tells you at the top of the chapter how old she is about that time. So in this particular section I was going to read, she's 6 years old. And it says, at that time, Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, died at Monticello in Virginia on July 4th, 1826. He was 83 years old. His original draft of the Declaration contained a vehement philippic against Negro slavery. Congress eliminated this, but these words were left intact. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This idea, part of Jefferson's legacy to America, written down in one of the country's noblest documents, was incompatible with the idea of legalized slavery. Yet it was an integral part of the heritage of all Americans, and so it troubled the minds of men in the North and in the South long after Jefferson's death. Many a slave carried the dream of freedom in his heart because of these words of Jefferson's, not because the slave had read them, but because they were written down somewhere, and other people had read them, and ideas are contagious, particularly ideas that concern the rights of man. So I thought that was pretty cool that Petry includes those kind of historical tie-ins at the end. It also talks about Harriet's marriage to John Tubman, and I can't recall ever remember reading anything about John Tubman. It's a little sad reading that relationship because it turns out that John wasn't quite the man Harriet thought he was, and she gets to a point where she kind of has to give up her personal interests for the better well-being of the people around her. She finds a higher calling in helping those around her, even though she craves having that, stable home life. So it's kind of sad that she couldn't have both, as it turns out, but it was still interesting to read about that relationship and how it affected the life choices she made. One of the things else I wanted to read you from here was this moment Harriet goes through where I think now she's in her teens. She gets called to work. I think at this point she does find working inside of a house, and she's called to be, I don't know if it's really a nanny, but sort of the attendant. I don't know if she's there full time. I think in this situation they were having her on like a trial period or something like that. But it talks about how she was called in to watch over this white woman's baby. With this woman, the woman known in here named Miss Emily, she's always giving Harriet crap. I mean, she wants her to watch the baby, but she's constantly over her shoulder criticizing everything she's doing and looking for her to fail. At one time, the baby starts crying, like babies do. Oh, sorry. Misread that. Miss Emily is actually the one, I think, that comes to Harriet's aid. It's Susan, I guess, is the woman who had the baby that ends up being on Harriet's case all the time. And at one point, Susan is beating Harriet for what she thinks is neglect of the child. And they're talking about Miss Emily hearing the screaming. And it said, Susan, what are you doing? What's the matter? Miss Emily heard the screams and came downstairs protesting. Why do you whip the child, Susan, for not doing what she's never been taught to do? Talking about Harriet as a child. Leave her to me for a few minutes and you'll see that she'll soon learn how to sweep and dust a room. Harriet learned how to clean the house. She was also working as a house slave, cleaning in the house as well as taking care of this child that they'll talk about later. She looked after the baby too. In later life, she said, I was so little that I had to sit on the floor and have the baby put in my lap. The baby was always in my lap, except when it was asleep or its mother was feeding it. Miss Susan said that the baby mustn't be allowed to cry. Harriet had to keep rocking it so it wouldn't cry. Every night the same thing happened. She sat on the floor and rocked the cradle back and forth until the baby went to sleep, and then her head would droop, Harriet said. Her eyelids closed, and her hand would start slipping away from the dark polished wood of the cradle. Finally, she slept on the floor by the cradle, and then the baby would wail suddenly, a thin, high, piercing sound. Miss Susan would wake up furious and reach for the whip she kept on a little shelf beside her bed. Harriet finally reached a point in exhaustion where she was past needing sleep, where she snatched it in brief moments, head nodding, eyes closed, and yet not really asleep, prepared to start rocking the cradle before the baby woke and cried. Even so, sometimes she went sound asleep to be awakened by the wailing of the baby. She was whipped so often that the back of her neck was covered with scars, crisscrossed with scars, so deep that they would be visible for the rest of her life. Finally, she learned to sleep without really going to sleep. learned to listen while still asleep, head nodding, eyes closed, but all her senses alert to the slightest movement from the cradle. Listening, listening, and yet asleep. So if the baby stirred, she would start rocking the cradle. Harriet slept, and yet she was listening. Sound asleep, but listening. Not for the baby, ears straining even in sleep, for the sounds of footsteps on the stairs. Not even footsteps, just the creak of stairs. And she was awake because it meant Miss Susan was coming home. Thus she learned to stay alert, even though she was deeply, restfully asleep. And then there was an incident later with table sugar. One morning after breakfast, Miss Susan had the baby, and I stood by the table waiting until I was to take it. Near me was a bowl of lumps of white table sugar. My mistress got in a great quarrel with her husband. She had an awful temper, and she would scold and storm and call him all kinds of names. Now, you know I never had anything good, no sweet, no sugar, and that sugar right beside me did look so nice, and my mistress's back was turned to me while she was fighting with her husband, so I just put my fingers in the sugar bowl to take one lump, and maybe she heard me, for she turned and saw me. The next minute she had the rawhide down. I give one jump out the door, and I saw they came after me, and I just flew, and they didn't catch me. I ran and ran, and I ran past many houses, but I didn't dare stop, for they all knew my mistress, and they would send me back. She ran until she was exhausted. She kept looking over her shoulder. Harriet again. After a while, she didn't see Miss Susan and her husband. She decided that they must have got tired and stopped chasing her. So she slowed her pace, and then at the thought of having to go back to Miss Susan and whatever form of punishment she and her husband would devise, she started running again. She said, "By then I was so tuckered out I came to a great pig pen. There was an old sow there and perhaps 8 or 10 little pigs. I was too little to climb in it, but I tumbled over the high part and fell in on the ground. I was so beaten out that I could not stir. And there I stayed from Friday until the next Tuesday, fighting with those little pigs for the potato peelings and the other scraps that came down the trough. The old sow would push me away when I tried to get to her children's food, and I was so awfully afraid of her. By Tuesday I was so starved and I knew I had to go back to my mistress. I didn't have anywhere else to go, even though I knew what was coming, and so I went back." Imagine trying to live with somebody that was that much of an evil hag, and you just didn't have any choice, so you had to go back. It's a pretty powerful story in this little book. I think it's good if you want to introduce young readers to history, or if you want to get into bios yourself and are a little bit hesitant, this is a good sort of baby step into that, because it's short, it's a bio, but it's written like a novel, so it'll be a fast read. So yeah, I definitely recommend that one. The next one I got into was The Butler by Wil Haygood. This is a little bit different. This started out as a magazine or a newspaper article that Wil Haygood ended up extending into a book. And this talks about the life of Eugene Allen, who was a real-life butler in the White House, African-American butler, and he worked there for 35 years, worked for 8 different presidents from, I think it was Truman through to Reagan, then retired, and years later, when Wil Haygood was covering the first presidential campaign of Barack Obama, basically what he says in the book is he was seeing all of the hype and excitement that was being built up around people, their excitement at having the first black president, and he got the idea that, hey, we should ride this wave of excitement and try to find another story that has this same sort of historical power behind it. So he wanted to find another African American tied to the White House or in the area that he could sort of piggyback on this story. And one of his contacts tells him about Eugene Allen, who worked at the White House. So he goes and tries to find Eugene Allen and ends up tracking him down and meeting Eugene and his wife. At the point when he met Eugene was very much into his senior years, had a lot of health problems, but he and his wife were still kicking. This is the story of what Wil Haygood learns from his interviews with Eugene. And then, of course, it was later turned into the movie The Butler that was directed by Lee Daniels. And this one, when I first heard the story of Eugene Allen, I was really fascinated to learn his story and his history. Because just the idea that somebody could be working in the White House that long and cover that many administrations, you just think about the history they must have seen. That sounds like a fascinating story. What disappointed me about this was there's not that much of his history in this. It's kind of broken in half, where the first part is about Eugene Allen, but even the first part is it's just really quick. I don't know if because there wasn't that much history to talk about, but I find that hard to believe. But the second half of the book has almost nothing to do with Eugene Allen. It's just talking about African Americans in film history and important films that starred black actors, and the history of that, where it's been to where it is now, which was still interesting, but I felt like the focus was supposed to be on Eugene Allen. I felt like his story just sort of got glossed over, and I don't know, there was something about the idea that Wil Haygood just looking for this guy because he wanted to ride on the excitement of Barack Obama's campaign, that sort of bothered me a little bit. I wanted it to be more like it was more about Eugene Allen and not so much riding the hype. I mean, I get it because I get the journalistic motivation behind it, but it's still, there was something to that kind of bugged me. But still, for what is here, there is still interesting history that I would recommend checking out. I mean, it's really short read. There was one story I was going to share in here that I thought was pretty cool that talks about Eugene Allen working during President Kennedy's party he threw for the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. And it said, he was there at the White House in 1963 when President Kennedy hosted an event to honor the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. Allen and the other Butlers had never seen so many blacks in the White House at one time, upward of 800 floating about, among them Langston Hughes and Sammy Davis Jr. One of the black guests cracked that it was like being inside Uncle Tom's cabin. Sometimes, on getting back to the White House kitchen, when he'd pause for a break, he'd just shake his head at the wonder of social progress. Allen himself had been born in the former Confederacy, and only 54 years after the end of slavery. We know, of course, that the Kennedy years would come to a tragic end. When President Kennedy was shot in Dallas, Allen and the other crestfallen Butlers awaited the arrival back at the White House of those who had traveled with Kennedy. He remembers First Lady Jackie Kennedy being in a near catatonic state, and there were the low-pitched voices of the Kennedy children that seemed particularly sad. When Allen went home on the night of the Kennedy assassination, he felt strongly that he should get back to the White House. He couldn't sleep. He prepared to return. Helene cautioned him about going out so late, with so little rest, but he was determined. As he was putting on his coat in the hallway, he collapsed into sobs. Charles, his son, would later tell me that was the only time he ever saw his father cry. That particular scene is actually really powerfully portrayed in the movie as well. It has a lot of shots from the movie. One thing I will clarify about the movie is not a direct translation of Eugene Allen's life. In the movie, the butler, the main character, is actually called Cecil Gaines. He is inspired by the life of Eugene Allen. So it's not a direct translation. But speaking of the African-American cinematic history, there was one story in here that involved Sidney Poitier that I thought was pretty powerful when he talks about filming the movie In the Heat of the Night. Amazing movie, by the way. But it said, in the plot of In the Heat of the Night, Poitier played a northern police officer who gets stranded in Mississippi. While there, he's talked into helping solve a local murder. Before filming started, Poitier let director Norman Jewison know he was not going to film in hostile Mississippi. Civil rights workers had been murdered in that state, after all. The production filmed in Illinois and in Tennessee. While the actors were in Tennessee, however, after hearing some rednecks spew epithets, Poitier let it be known that he was sleeping with a gun beneath his pillow. So, yeah. Those kind of stories behind the scenes you don't hear about, that he was that unnerved just shooting a movie, even at that time, that he still slept with a gun under his pillow. It's crazy. So yeah, it's a quick little read. It's interesting background. With this particularly though, in my opinion, I got more out of seeing the movie. I would highly recommend seeing the movie at least once, because one thing that really impressed me about the movie is I think it covers history in a way. It gives you a visual that just reading the books might not otherwise give you. It makes it, it has a way of hitting home more. It's important to read history books as well, but there's something about when you're just reading it in a book, sometimes you can be a little bit, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is. It doesn't strike you in the same way sometimes when it's just words on paper. Sometimes your brain just looks at it and goes, yeah, that's sad. We should not do that anymore. But when you see a visual of people actually being attacked, lynched, set on fire, beaten, spit on, when you see that visual in your face, it strikes you in a way that just reading a paragraph is not going to do in the same way. So for that, I would definitely recommend seeing the film, because it makes the history sink in that much more. And all the performances are pretty brilliant in that film as well. There's a ton of stars in that movie. And when I watched the movie, I watched it on DVD, and I would also recommend watching some of the extras on the DVD, because there's a thing I thought was pretty cool that they talk about when they interview the actors. A lot of the actors said that they felt so compelled, both black and white actors in the film, felt so compelled to be in this movie that they actually, almost all of them took pay cuts to do it. They were that set on having this story told. So it's pretty powerful stuff. So yeah, I would definitely recommend taking a look at that when you get a chance. Next up, we have Go Tell It on the Mountain by James Baldwin. I feel like 2015 was kind of the year of James Baldwin on BookTube. I myself have, I don't know, 4 or 5 of his books on my shelves that I haven't gotten to yet, because I wanted to get to them, but that's just the same BookTube problem, is so many books, not enough time. And I kept trying to catch up, and so yeah, I definitely wanted to get to them. Didn't get a chance last year. Remedied that this year. So I started digging into them. I started with Go Tell It on the Mountain just because I figured that was the first book of his I bought. Might as well start there. And yeah, all the things you hear on BookTube, they're true. The guy is amazing. With a lot of these books, I have one more book to talk about after this. And with all of these, I'm trying not to go super in-depth in this video, because there's a lot that I had thoughts about, and I don't want this video to be insanely long. So I'll just say right here that I'll put the reviews of all of these, my written reviews, down below, where I get much more in-depth about my thoughts. So if you want to know more in-depth about what I thought about each one, just click in the down area down there and find the book you're interested in. But this one, if you're not familiar, it's funny because it's a relatively short book. I mean, this edition is just over 220 pages, 225, I think. But there is so much story just in this book. It's almost like this big family saga. When you get to the end of it, you feel like you went through a big family saga, even though it's less than 300 pages. But it starts with the story of John. And John is, I think they're living in Harlem, I want to say. Or maybe the Bronx, somewhere in New York. And John is the son of a preacher. And he has his brother, I'm blanking on the brother's name, Roy. His brother Roy. They're living with their parents there. And I think Roy is the older brother. Not much is expected of Roy. They just kind of let Roy be Roy. But John is sort of the bookish, quiet, introspective one. John is the one that they expect is going to take over his father's footsteps and all of that. But John is kind of struggling in that he does have interest in it, but he doesn't know if that's where he wants his life to go. He's not yet fully convinced that that's his life path. So we learn about John in the beginning and his kind of strained relationship with his parents, both his mother and his father, for different reasons. His father can be a little bit, I don't know if it's cold, but his father can be a little bit kind of, he has that sort of abrasive, sort of disciplinarian type demeanor. And when you first meet John's mom, she comes off kind of as a pushover. Little bit of a doormat. At least that's how she comes off initially. But as you get into her story, you kind of learn the intricacies between her and her husband and what's really going on there and why she gives him so much slack and all of that. So it starts with that, and the story's kind of divided up in parts. So you first meet John, and then the story starts to go back into history of John's family tree, and you learn about the different stories of John's mother and his father, who they were individually, how they came together. There's also a story about the first wife of John's father, who is not John's mother. John is the child of the second wife. So you learn about his father's relationship with the first wife and how that affected him. It goes back even further, how John's father had a bit of a rougher early years before he came around to being a respected member of the church and all that. It goes into all this history back and forth of all these people that are in John's family and how their stories affected his story, and how it, even in his current reality, how those histories are still sort of swirling around him and affecting the way he looks at the world. When you think about it, it's not a complicated story, but it is a powerful story. I mean, for anyone, when you think about how the stories of our ancestors affect who we are now, whether we realize it at first or not, that's going to resonate with anyone. The thing that really stuck with me is just the way Baldwin writes. I don't know if that's because he was also a poet. He just has this natural way with words. His language doesn't get complicated. He's not trying to go out of his way to impress you. He's one of those writers that has a natural ability to just pick the right words and give you the right feeling. And there's something to his writing that I don't experience a lot, that it has the sensation of, the feeling of like when you're having sort of those quiet moments with your friends, or maybe your life partner or loved one or something like that. Those quiet moments where you're kind of hanging out and you're really comfortable and you're sort of talking in a hushed tone and you're just sort of enjoying the quiet, but then you're so comfortable that these stories start to come out, and some of the stories are nice and cozy, and then some of the stories are sort of revelations or confessions almost. But whether the stories are good or bad, whether they're happy or heartbreaking, when people are telling you those kind of stories in that hushed tone, you just have this sort of cozy feeling where you like the feeling that you're being entrusted with this information, and life just feels good because you have that close bond with somebody. There's something about Baldwin's writing that gives me that same sensation of like when you're having those hushed conversations with somebody and you're kind of tucked up with someone you really care about, and you're hearing something, you're hearing something important. It's just, there's something to his writing that gives me that same sensation. And some of the sentences, it's that kind of writing where it's simple, but just the sort of sound it makes in your ear or your mind when you hear it. Like there was one line, I forget the context, but I wrote down, there was a line that said, the waters of anguish riding the world. And I was just like, damn! And, not only is it just great writing for anyone, but especially if you're interested in writing yourself, checking out his books is invaluable because just the writing style blew my mind. So yes, get into your Baldwin. And then the last book I have to talk about is a nonfiction book. This is Elizabeth and Hazel by David Margolick. This is sort of a dual bio that talks about Elizabeth and Hazel, who are the two women featured in this pretty iconic photograph of the civil rights movement. This has to do with the Little Rock Nine and the integration of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, I believe. I think it was September 1957. This was after, was it the Brown versus Board of Education? After that went to court, Central High School was one of the first schools that came out and said, okay, we're going to try this integration thing. 9 students in Little Rock, Arkansas were chosen to be the first to attempt this integration in a still very volatile, very racist city. It was nerve-wracking, to say the least, for the people involved. But this was one of the most famous images taken that day. There were a number of photographers that took different angles of this. This one by Wil counts, for whatever reason, was one of the most published angles and one of the ones that gets in the history books the most, even though there were, I think, 3 or 4 different versions of this same moment photographed. But this is Elizabeth Eckford here, and this is Hazel Bryan here. And as you can see, Elizabeth was one of the what came to be known as Little Rock Nine, the 9 students chosen. And this is Hazel, who got photographed yelling racial slurs and hate comments at her while she walked to school. This is a really interesting sort of dual bio that looks at both of them, who they were before that moment, how they got to come into the same area, how they got to know each other, how they were sort of bound forever in history together, and who they ended up being as people in their later years. David Margolick, he actually went and met both of them and interviewed them and talked to them. Elizabeth was scarred for life from her experience. What happened was it took multiple times for the students to get into the high school because there was so much hatred towards them. When they finally got in, even though they had guards there, the guards at that point mostly covered by the National Guard by the time they got settled in their classes. The National Guard was there, but they weren't really doing that much to quell the anger and the hatred. So even when Elizabeth finally got into the school and started attending classes, she still got attacked. She got racial slurs thrown at her. She got pushed, shoved. She got shoved downstairs multiple times. She had flies dropped in her school lunches. She had people that would set spitballs on fire and spit them at her. And she had, there's descriptions of how she would go to PE class, and then when PE class was over, when she was in the showers, people, or before she got in the showers, people would scatter glass shards in her shower stall right before she went in. That was just some of what she went through. And she ended up developing PTSD from all this, basically. Even when she left school as an adult, she never got over the trauma. She tried, she had plans of going to law school. She wanted to be a lawyer. Couldn't do it. She was so traumatized. She tried to go into the military. She thought maybe she could do that. Even that didn't work out. So she ends up just staying in her parents' house, in the town she grew up in. And even after her parents die, she does end up having 2 sons. She raises her sons in that house, but on a very meager income, just scraping by and still dealing with the effects of PTSD from all the trauma she endured. So that's what she went through. Hazel, she describes how after this day, she didn't really think much of the incident at first. She went on with her life, and she said somebody took a shot of this one time, and it also ends up affecting Hazel for the rest of her life, because the person she is in this picture is not the person she stayed. What happened was Hazel, she admits, she says she got caught up in the moment. There were all these people that were doing the same thing, and she said she caved to, you know, getting caught up in the energy and the peer pressure, and so she kind of thrived on attention, and so she was going to be the star of the moment, and that's what you see here. She said once she got out of school, she married really young, had children really young. She ends up finding religion and then feels really bad about what she did and how she acted, even though this was her only moment of interaction that day with Elizabeth. She was not, as far as she admits, she was not part of the people that, you know, were physically traumatizing Elizabeth. But I think Elizabeth still saw Hazel as sort of a representative of the kind of people she had to survive. But Hazel went on to live her life, and what struck her as she was watching, I think she said she was watching a program on TV or something like that, and her picture flashes up, and then it sort of dawns on her. At that time, her kids were still really small, and she said, I don't want my kids to grow up racist. Because at that point, she had found religion. She decided the way she was raised in a racist home was wrong. But she realized she wasn't putting enough emphasis on how wrong it was with her own children. So what she does is she takes it upon herself to track down Hazel's contact information, and she finds Elizabeth's contact information, and she finds Elizabeth's phone number, calls Elizabeth, and without any, like, she doesn't call the media and tell anybody she's going to do this. She does it on her own time and just calls Elizabeth personally and says, you know, I know it's been a lot of years, but I was just thinking about what you went through, and I want to say on my part, I'm sorry. And that first conversation ends up being multiple conversations, and much to everybody's surprise, over time a friendship actually develops between Hazel and Elizabeth. They find out that they like a lot of the same things. They like to garden, they like to go thrift shopping, and so they end up spending time together, and they go to I think what they called a racial healing seminar together, where victims and bullies of racial discrimination come together, and or reformed bullies, I should say, come together and talk about feelings and try to remedy wounds of the past. So they went to one of those seminars. They did talks together, went to schools and other public forums, and tried to show people that you can heal from these sort of things, and you can make things right, which I think is a pretty powerful statement that I don't think gets told enough. I think in even modern times now, I still see a lot of separation between the races, because the Black community is so wounded that there's a number of people I've heard that are now sort of blanket statementing, you know, stupid white people, stupid honkies, all that. And that attitude is not any more successful at fixing the problem than what the whites have done with the cases of police brutality. And it's just, there's still a very concrete division between races, because there are whites that are out there trying to remedy the wounds that their ancestors put on people, and it's not getting enough attention, which sucks, because all that does is fuel the fires of racism between all races, saying, no, you're bad, no, you're evil, you're not doing anything. So I think stories like this are important to show that there are people within the races that are trying to bridge the gap and trying their best to fix the wrongs of the past. What kind of broke my heart about Hazel's story was that she really tried. She admitted she was wrong for what she did. She called Elizabeth on her own time. Didn't make a big media thing about it. Didn't tell anyone. She went to these seminars to try to, you know, create a platform for both of them to talk out their feelings. He basically tells Elizabeth, hey, no, say what you want to say to me. I deserve it for what I did. And she gives her a way to air out her rage and her pain multiple times. And she also talks about how she goes into education and she plans these trips for inner city kids to help them have experiences on field trips. She goes to different bookstores and tries to educate herself on Black history, taking out stacks of books on Black authors and Black history, and just doing whatever she can think of to make amends for her behavior. What sucks is the media would not let her get away from her past. It would not. When she and Elizabeth got back into the media, when their story came out, the media wasn't giving that much attention to any gaps being bridged. It was all about, look what she did in the past, look at her, she's a racist still. And she's like, I'm not, though. I made a mistake in the past. I am trying to correct it. And nobody wanted to hear that story. And it really struck me, hearing their story from both of them, how much the media is fueling the racism even now. That there are good stories out there that are not being told because for some reason the media feels like there's some benefit in having everyone hate each other. So there's so much powerful history in this book from both points of view, and it's still heartbreaking because it doesn't end on a perfect note. There's still a lot of pain that still needs to be processed on both sides. There's still a lot of grievances that still need to be addressed. But it's a history that, again, I think anyone can benefit from. It wasn't an easy read, but it gave me a lot to think about and a lot to process. And yeah, I would recommend it to any of you to have the same experience, to, you know, further educate yourself and remedy the more than likely whitewashing education you got in school. So yeah, that's what I covered for the Martin Luther King weekend. And like I said, I'm talking about it now because it is Black History Month, so I still feel like there's relevance. And as I said, you know, there's always relevance to it because it's important history. So I hope you enjoyed this video and found some reads that maybe, you know, sparked your interest in the topic. And I guess that's it for now. So we'll see you in the next video. Bye guys.